Okay, so far we've been talking about social cognition in general, the general principles that apply to anybody anywhere who wants to understand what's going on in the social world. But the study of social cognition in general also has implications for personality. That is to say, how individuals deal with these individual understandings. And that's what we're going to talk about this week. This is a departure from the usual way in which we think about personality. We usually think about personality in terms of individual differences. That is, that there's something like the normal distribution of various kinds of personality traits or personality characteristics. Some people are high, some people are low in extroversion or neuroticism. Most people fall somewhere in between. That general approach to personality has dominated the science of personality for well over a century. And for those of you who have taken a course in personality psychology, like Psych 150, you'll recognize that that's really the general idea behind both the psychodynamic theories of personality and the so-called trait theories of personality. People like Sigmund Freud argued that personality, individual differences, had their roots in the resolution of various kinds of conflicts involving infantile, sexual, and aggressive tendencies. Then there were these so-called neo-Freudian theories that both took the sex out of Freud and took the biology out of Freud. These are not particularly successful as personality theories because they weren't particularly scientific. They were based on anecdotal case studies on people's, including Freud's, impressions of his patients, rather than anything that we would recognize today as hard data. More successful in scientific terms have been so-called trait theories of personality, which try to describe a particular structure for individual differences and is now settled on what's known, we've talked about this a couple of times, as the big five structure of personality. These big five traits: neuroticism, extroversion, agreeableness, conscientiousness, openness to experience, that people get a level of. That level is supposed to stay relatively stable throughout their lives, kind of thing that can be assessed in standardized tests like personality questionnaires, and that are supposed to give a kind of predictability to personality. There is another approach to personality, however, one that is deeply rooted in one of the oldest traditions in psychology, which is known as learning theory. And you can see one expression of that in the emphasis in, say, the Fisk and Taylor book on the importance of the situation as the controlling an individual's experience and thought and action. In learning theory terms, what we're talking about here are the contingencies of reinforcement. What stimuli are present in the environment, which stimuli have been associated with various kinds of behaviors in the past, which stimulus-response connections have been reinforced. The general idea behind these learning theory approaches to personality is that personality isn't rooted in biology, it's not rooted in the genes or in hormones or sex differences or anything like that. Rather, that a person's personality is something that's acquired through a history of learning. We learn to become the people we are, whatever that is, neurotic introvert, neurotic extrovert, or whatever. And that, most importantly, whereas the Freudian type theories, the psychodynamic theories of personality, and the trait theories of personality basically assume that once you've got a personality, you keep it forever. These learning theory approaches to personality assume that personality isn't given once and forever, but that when the conditions of learning change, when the contingencies of reinforcement change, personality can change as well. So the personality isn't maintained by some biological structure like your genes or your hormonal endowment or anything like that. It's maintained through learning, and the same learning processes that maintain personality can also be employed to change personality. Okay. Now, obviously, the background for this is in an approach to psychology in general known as behaviorism. And it's important for you to understand that there are two different kinds of behaviorism that are at play in the history of psychology. You'll remember that around the turn of the 20th century, 1915, 1919, John B. Watson argued that psychology ought to get out of the business of thinking about cognition and emotion and motivation and all those other mental states and simply look at things that could be observed, stimuli that are present in the environment and the organism's response to it, and that everything else, all mental states, mental structures, mental processes, should be banished from the vocabulary of psychology. That is a position known as radical behaviorism, and it was associated with John B. Watson at the beginning and is more commonly associated with people like B.F. Skinner now. There is a second kind of behaviorism, however, which is important for us, and it's known as neo-behaviorism. And neo-behaviorism agreed that the basic data for psychology was the behavior of the individual organism. But neo-behaviorism didn't eschew reference to the mental states of any kind. So we have to have empirical observations of behavior as the basic data for psychology. All of psychology is based on two basic behavioral types of behavioral observations: self-reports and reaction time. That's really what psychology has to work with. You go into a memory experiment, you see a list of words, the experimenter says, what do you remember? You're reporting what you remember. You go into a attention experiment, and you're asked to press a button every time you see a particular kind of stimulus appear on the computer screen. That behavior is measured in terms of something like response latencies. It's all self-report or response latencies. There isn't anything else. But while the radical behaviorists like Watson and Skinner didn't make any reference to any kind of mental event intervening between environmental stimulus and behavioral response, the neo-behaviorists were quite happy to do that. Edward C. Tolman, after whom Tolman Hall is named, Berkeley's most famous psychologist ever, argued that cognitive states like expectations mediated between stimulus and response. His great friend and rival Clark Hull at Yale argued that drive states, motivational states, intervened between stimulus and response. When you talk about expectancies or you talk about drives, you're talking about mental events, that just kind of shows you the difference between the approach of neo-behaviorists like Tolman and Hull and radical behaviorists like Watson and Skinner. But all of them argued that the basic data for psychology is something having to do with behavior. Now, what does all this have to do with psychology? Again, the theoretical interest in social learning theory, in some respects, really is epitomized by this guy. This is B.F. Skinner. It's his official portrait. He looked just like that. Who argued that all human behavior is under the control of environmental stimuli. Okay, That's what we mean when we talk early on in this course about the doctrine of situationism. That was essentially Skinner's idea. So that all you need to know about an organism, whether it's a person or a rat or a pigeon, is what its reinforcement history is, that is, what it's been reinforced for doing in the past, what discriminative stimuli are present in the environment at the current time, and also what are the current contingencies of reinforcement. That is, what is the organism going to be reinforced for doing. And Skinner argued that what was true for rats and pigeons was no less true for human beings. The only thing that made human beings complicated was that the stimulus conditions were more complicated. We have longer, more varied reinforcement histories, and we have longer and more varied reinforcement histories. That's the only kind of difference. All right, so let's see where this takes us. Arthur, the Stats and his spouse were the first to try to apply Skinnerian principles of learning to the human case. They argued that all aspects of personality and motivation and social behavior, all sorts of things, were under stimulus control, just like Skinner said they were. And they tried to use learning theory as a kind of unifying principle. It was what they called social behaviorism, really doing a stimulus response analysis of individual personality and social interaction. What happened at roughly the same time is that the principles of learning derived largely from the animal learning laboratory began to be applied in the clinic. Before the late 1950s, the prominent mode of psychotherapy was one form or another of Freudian psychoanalysis. Beginning in 1958 with the work of Joseph Volpe, more behavioral, less psychodynamic techniques began to be employed. Volpe basically based his treatment of phobias and obsessive compulsive disorder and other anxiety-related disorders on Hollian learning theory, and mostly really on the principle of extinction of learned responses. Ayon and Azrin tried to do the same kind of thing with Skinner-type functional behaviorism, applying principles of the contingencies of reinforcement to therapy. You got a smoker. You don't try to understand how smoking is an attempt to resolve his Oedipus complex. You simply change the contingencies of reinforcement that are associated with smoking. And all this kind of comes to a head in 1967 with the founding of a professional association devoted to the advancement of behavior therapy. 67 is a big date in cognitive psychology, as you know by now. And what happens is that in 1967, all of this takes what you might call a cognitive turn. That whereas Volpe was talking about Pavlovian extinction and Ayon and Azrin were talking about Skinnerian reinforcement contingencies, what happened in the late 1960s was that various theorists began to pick up on neo-behaviorist principles and reinserting mental states and mental processes as intervening between stimulus and response. These are two leaders. This is Aaron Beck, Tim Beck, and Albert Ellis, two founding figures in the field of cognitive the behavior therapy. Ellis technically came first with his notion of rational and motive psychotherapy. The general idea was your emotional reaction to things, whether you're afraid or depressed or whatever, is determined by how you think about things. So when Ellis got a patient in the laboratory, into his clinic, he would try to figure out how the patient was thinking about various events in his or her life and change those thought patterns. Tim Beck did much the same thing with respect to depression. His general argument was that people's deeply ingrained habitual patterns of thought were what was responsible for making them depressed, and the goal of therapy is not to talk about introjected anger the way a Freudian psychoanalyst would, but rather to change those beliefs. That depression has its origins in various what Beck called depressogenic schemata, and we just wanted to change those patterns. So again, this whole thing gets institutionalized in the early 1980s with the founding of a competing association for behavioral and cognitive therapies. Now, what does this have to do with personality? Well, exactly the same history gets repeated when we try to take learning theory, an aspect of cognitive psychology, and apply it to personality. The beginnings here come with two individuals. This is Neil Miller, a famous physiological psychologist who spent most of his career at Yale, and John Dollard, a sociologist, actually, who also spent most of his career at Yale. The two of them together led what was known as the Institute of Human Relations, which was the first academic organization devoted to developing an interdisciplinary social science approach to human affairs. It was a very interesting idea. But Miller and Dollard articulated a position known as, which we'll know now as classical social learning theory, which basically said that personality develops as a system of habits. That is, we learn to be extroverted if we're extroverted. We learn to be agreeable if we're agreeable. All these social behaviors are acquired through learning, and learning that occurs not like in some Skinner box with levers and lights and food hoppers and all of that, but rather in a social context. Miller and Dollard's basic exercise here was to illustrate the principles of social learning theory essentially by translating Freudian theory into the language of neo-behaviorist learning theory. It took Freudian concepts like drive and anxiety and defense and conflict and showed how you could analyze these in terms of learning. Okay, so the basic elements of classical social learning theory were these. The first is that we have a set of drives that activate behavior. Some of these drives are innate biological drives like hunger and thirst, but in the human case, most of these are secondary drives that are acquired through experience. That is, we learn to desire various kinds of things. You want a new car, you want a new smartphone, all of that. There's nothing biological about that. Those are the drives that are acquired essentially through the social learning. Then we have environmental cues that determine how the individual is going to respond. Some of these responses are going to be rewarded, and the reward takes the form of some kind of drive reduction. Either you're less hungry, or less thirsty, or you're less envious of your roommate's smartphone or your roommate's car or whatever. And that a lot of the action in social learning theory comes in the form of various kinds of imitation. I don't want to go into the details on this, but generally a lot of social learning has to do with doing what other people do. You want a smartphone like your roommates, then you got to go do what your roommate does. You want a car like your big brother's, then you got to go do what your big brother did to get it. And all of this was based on various kinds of animal models of various kinds of social behavior. Miller and Dollard together did a lot of studies involving rats, placed in various kinds of what they called approach avoidance conflict, where, for example, the rat would be taught to engage in some behavior in order to get food, but the behavior itself also had some negative consequences. Approach avoidance conflict is really what Freudian psychodynamic theory is all about, right? And so they again tried to bring this into the psychological laboratory and make some kind of science of it. Okay, so social learning theory that lasted for quite a while. It had some problems, one of which was precisely its reliance on animal models. When Miller and Dollard did their studies of approach avoidance learning in rats and then tried to convince people that that was what human personality was like, the difference between humans and rats just was too broad for the people to get their heads around. And also, frankly, Miller and Dollard relied excessively on Hull's learning theory, which began to fall apart in the mid-1950s. So there was a problem there. Based the whole thing on Hullian learning theory, and then the underpinnings kind of fell out from under them. But the really good thing about Miller and Dollard's work on classical social learning theory was that for the very first time, personality was brought into the psychological laboratory and was treated as a subject for that could somehow be related to general psychological theory. Before that, that really wasn't the case. Freudian psychoanalysis was way over there someplace, and then people like Raymond Cattell and others who were devising personality questionnaires, they didn't seem to fit in with what other psychologists were doing either. Miller and Dollard tried to unify the whole thing by talking about personality in the same way that their colleagues were talking about other aspects of psychology. Okay, what happens, though, is that pretty quickly, even in the 1950s, before we had a full-fledged cognitive revolution in psychology, is that cognitive constructs began to slip into social learning theory. The chief among these early theorists was a guy named Julian Roeder, longtime psychologist at Ohio State and then later at the University of Connecticut, who tried to produce a kind of eclectic fusion of two leading neo-behaviorist theories, Clark Hull with his emphasis on drive, and Edward C. Tolman with his emphasis on expectation. And Roeder, also influenced by Lewin, you see a variant here on Lewin's grand truism, behavior potential, that is, the likelihood that an organism would engage in some kind of behavior, was a function of two factors. First, the organism's expectancy of reinforcement, and second, the value that that reinforcement had for that person, okay? So here you've got a cognitive variant on Lewin's grand truism. Behavior is a function, remember, it's not the environment anymore, but expectancies, something that's going on inside the head of the behaving organism, and also reinforcement value, which is also as perceived by the organism. So reinforcement value is basically an idea derived from Hull. Expectancy is an idea derived from Tolman. But we're not talking about radical behaviorism anymore. We're talking about cognitive psychology, okay? And we know that because in the first place, Roeder defined reinforcement subjectively. An event wasn't objectively reinforcing. Not everybody could agree on it. You had to understand what the individual believed to be reinforcing. And the reinforcement contingencies were subjective. It didn't matter what the objective correlation was between behavior and reinforcement. What was important was what the organism, the individual, believed was the correlation between behavior and reinforcement. As a result of all of this, what Roeder did was to define the situation in subjective terms, just like Hull and the Thomases and other people did in terms of what the person believed the situation to be. And then finally, Roeder tried to understand where these expectancies came from, and he argued first, we get expectancies through our direct experience. You engage in some behavior that's intended to get you some kind of reinforcement, and it either works or not. If it works, then you do that behavior again the next time you want that reinforcement, or through imitation and observation. That is, you look out there and you see what other people are doing to get the things that they want, or more precisely, you see what other people are doing to get the kinds of things you want, and then you go off and do exactly the same kind of thing. Okay, so I'm going to skip this. This is all in the lecture supplements. Really, this is more for stylistic exposition than anything else. Roeder, ever the scientist, set out his theory not in terms of some kind of verbal description so much, but as a coordinated set of postulates and corollaries that he just kind of runs through. The unit of investigation for the study of personality is the interaction of the individual and his environment. Sounds like Lewin, right? And then there's a corollary that the study of personality is the study of learned behavior. Again, we're not talking about genes anymore. We're not talking about biological temperament. We're talking about learned behavior. Here's another one that's actually quite interesting. The investigation of personality has to be historical. You can't understand a person's personality unless you understand how he acquired that personality through a history of social learning. We'll just skip over these other postulates. Roeder, remember, combined Hull's emphasis on drives, on motivation, with Tolman's emphasis on expectancies or beliefs, and he postulated a whole bunch of psychological needs that he thought served as a basis for reinforcement. That is, reinforcing the events basically satisfied one or another of these expressly social needs, one for recognition and for status, another one for protection and dependency on others. He argued we had a need to dominate other people, also a need to be independent of other people, needs for love and affection, needs for physical comfort. This is the only need that Hull really introduced or allowed into his framework. Physical comfort. You're hungry, you get satisfied. You're thirsty, you get unthirsty. These are expressly the social motives, and they control a lot of the individual's social behavior. All right, and then the Roeder spent a great deal of time on expectations. First, expectations concerning the locus of control. He argued that we have a set of beliefs about whether reinforcements are dependent on other people or dependent on our own actions. This is what he called the external versus internal locus of control of reinforcement. Again, it's the individual's beliefs about the locus of control that matter, not what's objectively the case. And then Roeder also argued that an important dimension of individual differences was what he called interpersonal trust. In social behavior, we're usually relying on other people to deliver the reinforcements that we're working for. And so in order to work for those reinforcements, we have to be able to trust that other people will deliver the reinforcements to which we're entitled. And Roeder and his colleagues developed a new kind of personality questionnaire trying to assess both individual differences in locus of control and individual differences in interpersonal trust. All right, just to give you some idea about what these look like, this is Roeder's internal-external scale of locus of control. Many people can be described as victims of circumstances. You say yes to that, that's a point for external locus of control. What happens to other people is pretty much of their own making. You say yes to that, that's a point for internal locus of control. You get the idea. Here are items from Roeder's interpersonal trust scale. It's safe to believe that in spite of what